Have you ever wondered what actually changes as your salon grows from, let's say, 5 chairs to 8, then 16, and eventually 22? Most salon owners think more chairs equals more money. But here's the reality. Bigger doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the most profitable model isn't a giant 22 chair salon. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 perfectly run 8 chair salons.
So good. And here's another reality check. Too many salon owners confuse profit with their paycheck. And that can be a rookie mistake because you should be paid for the role you play inside of your company. And profit isn't your salary. Profit is the reward, the bonus, the overflow, for running a healthy company. And today we're going to walk you through the perfect salon blueprint, stage by stage, from 5 to 8 to 16 to 22 chairs and beyond, and we will share the real stories from our own salons and salon owners we've had the opportunity to work with over the years. And we'll look at companies like Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, and Dutch Bros to see how they've solved the same problem. And since we're talking about blueprints, we love, how many of you guys, if you've ever maybe seen the movie, or sorry, not the movie, the show, The Prophet, we love the way that Marcus, is it Lemoyne? Do you
Lemonis,
remember?
yeah, I think
Lemonis,
it's
yeah.
Lemonis.
Yeah, just the way that he views things, one of his most infamous lines is people, process, product, and if one of those three is broken, the whole thing collapses. And so we're going to kind of weave what his perspective would be into every stage of the game.
Oh, so good. I love that show. So excited that we're calling that forth today to kind of marry that into the salon world as well. And so let's start with stage one, which we mentioned, the 5 chair salon. And I like to call this the hustle stage. I remember when we had 5 chairs, I was hustling hard. Sometimes somebody would call out and Superwoman would step in. Her name was Jen, and she would say, "No fear, Jen is here. I'll take on that client. I'm already working 12 hours. Perfect. I'll work 13 hours. Great." I was cutting, I was answering the phone, I was checking in guests, folding towels, closing the register at night. And it was exhausting, but it was also the foundation. When you think about the 5 chair salon, most of the time your profit margins run about 8 to 12%. And that's if we had a good month. And right now you might be saying, Jen, I'm at 5 chairs and we're at a big fat 0. I understand that too. This is just a stat. But every missed shift sometimes felt like a gut punch. Like I said, one stylist called out sick and suddenly the whole week looked shaky. And I think about this from the perspective of what Marcus would say. And he would say at 5 chairs, the people are everything. And he says, people over, I can't remember what he says, but the people were everything. But here's the problem. You are the business. So like, if I'm pointing at myself, it's me. I was the business. And in the long run, that's not truly sustainable. Like you've got no processes yet. And your product, which is just the haircut, the color, the facial, isn't just about hair or skin, it's the brand experience. And, if your bathroom looks like a broom closet, you're not selling transformation, you're just selling haircuts. So if you think of it like a 5 chair salon like this, think of a chef with a 5 table bistro. Like he's cooking, he's serving, he's washing dishes. Like it's magical, but fragile. Starbucks actually started the same way. One tiny Seattle store obsessed with beans, but no systems, just passion. And that's truly what 5 chairs feels like. It's grit, it's passion, and it's very little sleep.
I love that. That is so great. And it reminds me of when we were once an 8-chair salon, and we got things really pumping in there. We had, 16 service providers in this 8-chair salon. And so the salon got loud, kind of in every sense. And, I remember one Saturday when 3 stylists had overlapping guests, the towels were running out, the front desk, thankfully we had finally got one at that stage, when we got it up to 16, they were overwhelmed, and I felt like I was running around like a traffic cop, and it made me realize, hey, what worked when you were serving and supporting less people no longer does when are starting to get to that place where you have 16 service providers in an 8-chair space, and we truly needed systems. We really needed consistency, and we absolutely needed leaders, And so I love to think about, like, what would Marcus say in that situation, and he would definitely point out, at 8 chairs, you can't wing it. You need process. And because if you can't leave for a week without things falling apart, you don't have a business. You have a job. And I don't invest in jobs. I invest in businesses. That would be his perspective on things, and it really makes me think about Starbucks, like you mentioned earlier, Jen, because this was Starbucks' challenge as well. Once they went beyond a few shops, they had to make every latte taste the same, and here's where some salon owners, choose a different path, or any business owners really, instead of going bigger, they start to replicate. They build 3 or 4 thriving 8-chair salons, and that's truly similar to like the Chick-fil-A model. They don't have just one massive store, but they have some smaller, high performing units, because each Chick-fil-A, I think this is so interesting, they average about $6 to $9 million a year. That's a lot for a lot of those locations. That's way more than Taco Bell. That's way more than KFC, Burger King, and the reason why this happens is because of all the tight systems they have and the culture that they're creating. And so I think, if we look at this truly from like an owner's mindset at this stage, you know, uh, when I was in that 8-chair salon, I was still paying myself a stylist wage because I was still a service provider. I was doing a little bit of leadership pay, but, I truly learned the hard way. Profit is not my paycheck. Profit is what I earn for building a healthy business. And my salary should really reflect the role that I play and not the scraps left over. If you can relate to that, you've been there before. I think that this is the stage where pay really does start to become confusing because you're like, gosh, I'm starting to get so busy. You're not quite to that next stage where you totally step out, maybe from behind the chair or table or whatever it is that you're doing, but you're also not always paying yourself the way that you should in this model.
That's so true. So true. And so let's think about going from went from 5 chairs to 8 chairs, and then we grew to 16 chairs. And when that happened, things started to break fast. I remember specifically one Friday. I was fully booked behind the chair, scissors in hand, Edward Scissorhand, making some magic happen. And every like few minutes, and a different team member would come over and ask me a question. It's like, "Hey, do you know where the developer is?" Or, "Hey, this guest is unhappy," or, "Hey, the computer's not working." Or, "Hey, do you think it's possible that I swap my Saturdays out with Jessica? I think she wants to work this Saturday." And I'm laughing because if you've been there, you probably are laughing too. And during that moment, that's truly when it hit me. It's like I couldn't run the floor, the salon stage is what I like to call it, and the company at the same time. If I didn't step out from behind the chair when we got to 16 chairs, like we would truly stall as a company.
Mhm.
And, it had me thinking of like, if you look at it from the instance of like, hey, what would Marcus say? And if you've watched The Prophet, you know exactly what he would say. He would say, at 16 chairs, it's not about cutting hair anymore. It's
Mhm.
about people. You have to think about, like, who's your super who's your leadership team,
Mhm.
who owns what responsibilities. If everybody is responsible, then nobody is responsible. And then he would also talk about the process, really looking at numbers, retention, rebook, average ticket. Like, if you're not tracking, you're guessing. And he would say, you know what? And I don't gamble on guesses. I actually think one time he did a salon, and I can't remember. I think you can actually see it on Hulu or Prime. So if you've never seen where he went in and transformed a salon, it was really interesting. And I remember him saying, like, I don't gamble on guesses. Like, your numbers are everything. We have to see the numbers.
Mhm.
It was just such a cool episode to watch. And I think somebody that's really good at not gambling on guesses is Chick-fil-A. We've been talking about them a lot. I feel like they really
Mhm.
nail this. Their operators aren't just managers, they're like culture protectors. Less than, is it 1% of applicants? I think it's 1%, right? Yeah, 1% of
Mhm.
applicants get accepted because they know leadership cracks will sink the ship.
Mhm.
So interesting. Apple does the same thing if you really think about it. They don't build super mega stores. They build smaller, consistent ones that usually generate about $5,500 per square foot. It's not that they're 5,500 square feet, but that's what they generate per square foot, which is the highest in retail. Isn't that so interesting? Because every
Mhm.
square foot is designed for loyalty and experience. And that's how a 16 chair salon must think. And so, if you've never done the math to figure out what you generate per square foot, that really is a huge opportunity to open your eyes. And once you get locked in on that number, is like, how could we improve our systems and processes to increase that number, which is going to be a huge win for everyone involved. And when you think about it from an owner mindset at this stage, you really, and I remember doing this myself too, I really truly had to start paying myself a CEO salary.
Mhm.
Profit wasn't what kept lights on anymore.
Mhm.
Profit became my bonus. It was like almost like your freedom fund. And your
Mhm.
business has to have profit, because at the end of the day, profit is the oxygen for your business. But I do feel like sometimes a lot of saloners do get confused about profit being their take home pay. And so when you're at a 16 chair salon, if profit is your take home pay, oh man, we're going to have some challenges that will come through.
So good, and really, we've gone through all of those different stages, 5, 8, 16, and by 22 chairs, I finally realized I wasn't leading stylists or service providers or beauty pros anymore. At that stage, I was truly leading leaders. And if you've been there before, it's not all sunshine. And I remember one meeting, there was, three different leaders, managers, who gave three different answers to the same question. And it had me thinking about that old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. And, that's when I realized my job wasn't to manage, it was to align. Because it doesn't always necessarily mean that there's too many cooks in the kitchen. It just means, hey, how do we get in alignment? How do we help everyone fully understand their role and their purpose here? Because margins can push, 18 to 22%, but only if communication was tight and culture was protected. And I think about, what would Marcus say in this instance? He would really say at 22 chairs, you're running a company within a company, because your people are your leaders, and your process has to scale or it will collapse under its own weight. And your product, you really have to think about, what is your point of difference? Why should a guest choose you over four smaller 8-chair salons, across town? And really even thinking about that from the stylist perspective too, the esthetician, whatever beauty pros you have in your space, why would they choose you over anyone else? And if you can't answer that one sentence, you're in big trouble. And when we look at some other businesses, that, have created similar things, Starbucks comes to mind. They have a Fifth Avenue location, and that store brings in about $20 million a year. You guys, it's not because it's bigger, but because it's a destination, and Dutch Brothers, they kind of have the opposite model. They don't have giant cafes. They just have thousands of drive-through shops, and each of them are doing about $2 million with 31% profit margins. Wow. That's a testament to their efficiency. That's a testament to their speed, really, and truly creating that culture. Because the one thing that we've learned seeing all of these different models and the profit margins and the team and the leadership and the systems that it takes to create that is we know for certain bigger isn't always better. Because if there's no profit, I remember it's been years ago working with, somebody who had multiple locations and absolutely no profit. And everyone was always like, wow, this, salon owner is so successful. But, is that success? Because one false move and every person in that company could lose their job, because profit is the oxygen for a company. And if there's no oxygen, you walk up one little steep hill, you're out of breath and you're done. So what we know is bigger isn't always better, but better is better.
Mhm. Better is better. I love that. I just did the quick math, Lindsay, on what you said on Dutch Bros. So at 31% profit margins, at 2 million, they're bringing home like $620,000 a year in profit. I
Wow.
think be good with that for a small
Yeah.
little drive-through coffee shop.
Sign me up.
Doing $2 million a year with
Mm.
$620,000. So that's so incredible how they've taken that one location that has a very stable foundation and been able to duplicate that. So
Mhm.
cool.
Mhm.
So let's settle this once and for all as salon owners, is that your salary is what you get paid for the role you play. Maybe that's stylist, manager, CEO. But profit is different. Profit is the overflow. It's the bonus, the dividend, the reward for running a healthy company. And I remember when I started separating my CEO pay from profit, like everything truly changed. I didn't panic when profit dipped because I wasn't relying on it to pay my bills. Profit became the reward for building something that worked without me. And then it actually became a great asset where I could go do other incredible things like real estate. And
Mhm.
so, when you think about it, here is your blueprint. At 5 chairs, you're the hustler. At 8 chairs, you're the system builder. At 16 chairs, you're the company builder. And at 22 chairs, you're the CEO leading leaders. But you
Mhm.
don't have to chase bigger. Like you truly could stop at 8 chairs and replicate it 3 or 4 times, just like we gave you that example in Dutch Bros.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. It really makes me think of actually a local restaurant that we have that there's just a line always waiting outside, and people, heard that they bought the little tiny property behind it. They were so excited that they were going to expand. And what did they do? They opened up a totally different restaurant to create that same bustling culture, and they also then now have a line waiting outside of the door, and everyone's always like, you need to expand. But what they've learned is what is profitable and what makes sense, because you don't have to chase bigger. You could stop at 8 chairs and replicate it 3 or 4 times, and never confuse profit with pay. Pay yourself for your role. Profit is the overflow, or as Marcus would say, people, process, product. If one is broken, the whole thing collapses. So wherever you are, if you're hustling at 5, struggling at 8, stepping up at 16, or leading at 22, the blueprint is clear. Thanks for tuning in. Share this with a salon owner that could really win from this. Join us at our next challenge, and let's build the perfect salon blueprint.